Among some members of the scientific community, psychology has a reputation for, well, not being a proper science. Many psychologists get offended by this, but actually there are some pretty good reasons for this criticism. Science is known for only accepting ideas after being tested carefully, many times under strict laboratory conditions. This results in high confidence in the validity of findings and, of course, the underlying theory. And you can see how this is possible in biology when testing cells, in chemistry when testing the reaction between chemical compounds, and in physics when testing the interaction between forces. You can perform the same laboratory experiment multiple times and you'll get exactly the same results. The problem for psychologists is we study behaviour, and in particular the organ responsible for behaviour, the brain. The brain is by far the most complex structure in the universe that we know of, and it has a particular feature. It knows it's being observed and will change its behaviour in response to that observation. It will also change its behaviour if it's placed under strict laboratory conditions. Also, the observers themselves are brains, observing other brains. It's relatively easy to be objective when studying a rock or a cell, but many of the questions that we ask in psychology are deeply important to us on an emotional level. So, researchers can be deeply invested in finding a particular result, and this can then cloud our interpretation of our observations. But in psychology's defense, it's a very new science. It's only been around in something like its present form for around 100 years. And there are features about how psychological research has been conducted, especially in the last few decades, that make it much more scientific and much more respected. Psychboost.com, over 170 videos to help you with your qualification, and Patreon supporters can access bonus resources, tutorial videos, and the Discord channel. Features of science, scientific concepts. So what is it to conduct research scientifically? And how does this apply to psychological research? Let's deal with a few important concepts. Empirical method. This is based on the philosophical position of empiricism, the idea that all factual knowledge comes from experience. And importantly, this means that factual knowledge does not come from speculation, logical argument, belief, or directly from theory. So empirical data is collected through direct observation. And in psychology, this is direct observation of participants. Quite simply, using the empirical method means it's not good enough to say you believe in an idea. You actually have to go out into the world and test it. If, for example, you have a new treatment for schizophrenia, it's not good enough just to believe it works, or even have a reasoned argument about why it should work based on our current psychological knowledge. Data has to be collected from direct observation of people taking the treatment. Objectivity. This means data should be collected and interpreted in a way that avoids bias, so avoiding being influenced by the researcher's own opinions or expectations. If research and the conclusions from that research have been influenced by bias, we would say they are subjective. Objectivity can be difficult, especially as bias can be unconscious, but there are some tools that the researcher can use to help with objectivity. The data collection process should be systematic, so it's gathered in a way that's carefully planned out and consistent for each participant. The data collection measures themselves, like questionnaire questions or experimental procedures, should be carefully designed. Or the researcher should use established questions or tests. The researcher can also use the double-blind technique. This is using another researcher, one who doesn't know the research aims, to actually collect the data. Also, one of the purposes of peer review is to identify biased research. So, for example, researchers making conclusions that are not really supported by the data, and stop that work being published. And knowing your work will be reviewed by other, hopefully neutral researchers, should make researchers carefully consider if they can justify their conclusions before sending it on to peer review. But importantly, if scientists don't collect their findings objectively, then they have no way of knowing if the data is a true reflection of the world, so valid, or if what they've just measured is just a result of their own bias, so invalid. Another important aspect of scientific research is control. I've already spoken about this in more detail already, but this is an important link to scientific processes. In an experiment, we assume that the change measured in the dependent variable is a result of the difference we've made in the levels of the independent variable. But this may not be true if we haven't controlled our experiment and there are extraneous variables. So without sufficient control, we're not able to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship. Replicability. An important part of the research process is scientists carefully recording their methods and producing standardized procedures. This is so other scientists can repeat their experiments and observations. And this is important as positive results could have been the result of fraud, an unknown variable in the participants, or a feature of the environment the experiment was conducted in, or even the positive result could have happened by chance. But if other scientists do find the same results using the same methods in a replication, our confidence in the validity of the original experiment's results increases, as well as the validity of the theory the experiment set out to test. Falsifiability. Now, you may automatically think scientists create a theory and then what they need to do is collect evidence to support that theory. But actually, according to Karl Popper, being able to collect supporting evidence is not enough for a theory to be truly scientific. For a theory to be scientific, it needs to be constructed in a way that it can be empirically tested, so tested in a way which shows it's not true. Popper explained falsifiability with the example theory, all swans are white. It was accepted for thousands of years in Europe as a proven fact that all swans were white. Because, well, every time someone made an observation, the swan was white. Well, they were wrong. In the 17th century, black swans were discovered in Australia. So, just one observation of a black swan was more important to the theory all swans are white than the millions of previous confirming observations of white swans. Because the black swan observation falsified the theory. I think you can see from this example why we can never finally prove a theory is correct. We always have to be open to contradictory evidence eventually coming along. In psychology, we could say the idea of a soul directing behaviours through free will just isn't a scientific concept, because unlike the swan example, the soul is an unfalsifiable concept. It's used to explain, but it's not observable. In fact, this is why some of Freud's ideas are criticised. The id, the ego, and superego are classified as unscientific because the way the concepts are explained by Freud means they're just not open to empirical experimentation, so can't be falsified. Paradigm shift. Another term we need to know is paradigm shift, and it's an idea suggested by a philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn. Now, it may seem that science develops slowly but consistently over time, developing by adding little bits of information to established theories. But actually, this isn't really how science works in practice. Science develops in a series of scientific revolutions. How this works is there tends to be an established set of shared assumptions that scientists have about an area of science works, and evidence is gathered to support that shared view. However, sometimes new contradictory evidence and theories are generated that just don't fit into the old paradigm, the old way of thinking about the world. When this evidence first appears, it's often rejected as it goes against the old paradigm that most scientists share. But more and more evidence is collected for this new way of explaining the concept until this evidence is so strong that the old way is rejected by the majority of the scientific community and they move over all at once to this new way of thinking. The most famous paradigm shift in science is the Copernican revolution. For thousands of years, early scientists and philosophers all thought the sun, planets and stars revolved around the Earth. Cosmologists even had complex models to try and explain the strange orbits of the planets. But the observations made by Galileo and his telescope in the 17th century provided strong empirical evidence that the Earth and the other planets orbited the sun. The findings could be replicated by anyone else with a telescope, and after some resistance, the Copernican model was accepted by the scientific community. We can see the same process in psychology, starting with Freud, Wundt, and other early psychologists who use introspection and case studies as tools to move away from a purely philosophical approach to understanding the mind. But then a paradigm shift happened from psychoanalytic approaches to behaviorism, with these new scientists ignoring internal mental processes but focusing on the cause and effect relationship in stimulus-response mechanisms. This approach was seen as more scientific and provided strong evidence to back up its theories. The next paradigm shift to cognitive neuroscience happened in the 1970s, when psychologists developed theories and techniques that included internal mental processes again. Now, most psychologists explain behaviour as a result of interactions between brain structures, which are explained by mental models provided by cognitive psychologists. These theories are supported by highly objective empirical evidence from machines like fMRI scanners, stages of scientific theory construction, and hypothesis testing. Scientific theory construction starts with observation. For psychologists, this is usually the observation of behaviour. It may be seeing young children performing the same actions as an adult, Perhaps a large part of the population commits horrific acts when ordered to by a person in authority. Or a dog salivates not to food, but just to the sound of someone approaching with food. From this observation, psychologists construct testable hypotheses, one that can be tested under carefully controlled procedures. So, an adult modelling aggressive behaviour towards a Bobo doll will be imitated by children. Normal people will obey the instruction to deliver a lethal electric shock when that instruction is given by an authority figure. Or a dog will drool on cue to the sound of a bell if the sound of the bell has been previously paired with food. This produces data, importantly experimental data. This has been gained empirically under controlled conditions. This can now be assessed with statistics to judge if this empirical data is strong enough to support the research hypothesis or not. If the data is strong enough, the researcher can now propose a theory that explains the results. That children are using internal mental processes to model the behaviour of adults. That extreme obedience is common and due to situational factors, not personality. And behaviour is due to learning and association between stimuli. What I've just explained is called the inductive or bottom-up process of theory construction. We started with the particular, an observation, and ended up with the general, the overall theory. Researchers can also go the other way, the top-down deductive method. Start with an established theory, say the multi-store model of memory, and then the researcher forms a testable hypothesis that will test one of the assumptions of that theory. These empirical observations either support, add to, or refute the existing theory. Now, the more a scientific theory can withstand attempts to test its assumptions by hypothesis testing, the more confident we are in the validity of that theory. I have 8 tutorial videos covering the AS and A-level research methods sections from 2017 to 2020. These videos have worked examples to every question and are full of exam tips. Patrons at the neuron level and above can access these and many more hours of exam tutorial videos, as well as over 100 printable resources from across the A-level over on psychboost.com. I do want to thank all the students and teachers who've supported PsychBoost over on Patreon during the development of the Research Methods unit. It's their support that allows me to teach part-time, so I can make PsychBoost on YouTube for everyone. I also want to give a special shout out to the patrons who support me at the developer level. So thanks to them, and I'll see you all in the next Research Methods video.